it's a bit odd because obviously, and tell me if I'm wrong, I thought the reports were that she had reached out to him, and now we're hearing, or what we're reading is that not only has she not reached out to him, but she has deleted his number and has got no intention of contacting him. So I don't quite understand why her team are saying one thing and then saying another. If she doesn't want to have any contact with her father, which I think it's sad if, when it comes to parents and children having fallouts. But if she doesn't want to, then that's obviously her decision. But it's a bit awkward when her team obviously saying one thing and then the next minute they're doing another thing, because then people are going to start questioning, is somebody lying? This is what starts coming into question.
Is it any of our business, though, Grant? We talked about this last week when the story first broke, and I just think, is it any of our business, whether it be Meghan Markle, whether it be anyone? Surely it's for her to decide.
I have to kind of agree with you on that, because technically, as they're no longer members of the working royal family, they do their own thing. So as you quite rightly said, it is actually her private business. She didn't really need to tell anyone about this, if she doesn't want to. Which is interesting, as I said again, that her team did mention that they had tried to reach out after her father said they hadn't. I think it's also difficult for her because even if she wants to keep it private, the fact that her father obviously, I think he had a journalist with him in the room, and obviously is keen to kind of get his kind of story out there. I think it's really difficult for them to keep it private. But the best thing for her to do would be to say nothing and just not get involved in this kind of thing, which is, can I say, what the royal family normally do when it comes to something like this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's not a lot of people who will be watching, really, who are, huge fans of Meghan for whatever reason. I think a lot of us share that position. However, what is she meant to do? If he is in his hospital bed and he's not been at all well and all the rest of it, but he's got a journalist sat next to him, I mean, you are going to be cautious. You're not going to know what on earth he's going to do.
No, exactly. And I think that's the worrying bit, is you are going to kind of worry about it. And even if, just say she wanted to go and be with him, well, how can you go and be with him and have a private time with him when there is a journalist there? It's really sad. And I think, again, as I said, with parents and children, when you have fallouts or things like this kind of happen, it's sad because it shouldn't be like this, really.
No.
What's striking here is how quickly the narrative keeps shifting, and not because of anything Meghan has said publicly, but because of what others keep claiming on her behalf. One moment we're told there was an outreach, then we're told there wasn't. One moment we hear reconciliation whispers, the next moment we're told contact has been completely cut off. And the confusion people feel doesn't come from secrecy, it comes from contradiction. When different versions of the same story circulate within weeks of each other, the public reaction is predictable. People start asking which version is true, who is actually speaking, and why does it feel like every update benefits someone else's storyline rather than reflecting a real private family situation. But that question alone already reveals the bigger issue. Why is this even framed as something the public needs clarity on in the first place? At its core, this is a story about an adult woman and her estranged parent. That's it. Strip away the titles, the headlines, the panel debates, and that's all that remains. And in any other context, this would never be treated as a rolling news saga. The uncomfortable truth is that the confusion isn't accidental. It's the byproduct of a media ecosystem that thrives on unresolved family conflict, especially when one side refuses to perform reconciliation on demand. Because here's the part that often gets ignored. Meghan herself has not gone on television to contradict anything. She hasn't issued emotional statements. She hasn't leaked timelines. She hasn't staged photo opportunities. The noise is coming from everywhere else. And that's why the contradiction feels awkward, not because her position is unclear, but because others keep trying to speak for her. There's also an assumption quietly baked into these conversations that she owes consistency to the public. That if she once attempted contact, she must always remain open to it. That if circumstances change, she must explain why. that emotional boundaries must remain static forever, regardless of behaviour on the other side. But that's not how real life works. People try, people stop trying, people reassess, people protect themselves. And none of that requires a press release. What makes this especially uncomfortable is the way the conversation keeps circling back to whether someone is lying, as if the only options are total honesty through media disclosure or deliberate deception. That binary ignores something far more common: disengagement. Silence is not a lie. Distance is not manipulation. And choosing not to participate is not proof of guilt. When someone decides they no longer want contact with a parent, that decision is often the result of years, not weeks. It's not impulsive. It's not petty. And it's rarely reversible just because circumstances become publicly sympathetic. And that brings us to the part of this discussion that many people instinctively avoid but can't honestly ignore: the presence of journalists. Because this isn't a hypothetical concern. This is not paranoia. This is not imagined distrust. There have been documented instances where private moments were immediately monetized. Conversations turned into quotes. Vulnerability turned into headlines. So when people ask, what is she meant to do? That question deserves a serious answer. What is anyone meant to do when private access comes with a camera, a recorder, or a reporter in the room? How do you grieve, reconcile, or even speak freely under those conditions? You can't. And that's the part critics tend to gloss over. They frame caution as cruelty. They frame boundaries as coldness. But they never ask whether any interaction would actually remain private. If you knew that anything you said might be filtered through a third party and sold to the highest bidder, would you walk into that room? Most people wouldn't. And they wouldn't be wrong for that. What's truly sad here isn't the lack of contact. It's the impossibility of contact that isn't transactional. Because reconciliation requires trust. And trust cannot exist where there is a history of public disclosure. The idea that someone should set aside that reality simply because the other person is unwell is emotionally persuasive but ethically shallow. Illness does not erase patterns. It does not undo past harm. And it does not obligate someone to sacrifice their own well-being. This is where the conversation often becomes unfairly moralized. People talk about parents and children as if biology alone guarantees safety. As if shared DNA automatically means healthy dynamics. But countless people watching understand that family estrangement is sometimes the healthiest option available. And yet, when Meghan is involved, that nuance disappears. Instead, she's expected to behave in a way that satisfies public sentiment, not personal reality. Another overlooked factor is that even attempting private contact doesn't guarantee privacy. Because if one side continues to speak to the press, then privacy is already compromised before the conversation even begins. That's not a neutral environment. That's not a safe space. That's a media trap. And it's telling that this possibility is often acknowledged and then dismissed in the same breath. Yes, it's sad. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, ideally, it wouldn't be this way. But wishing for a different reality doesn't change the one that exists. What also deserves scrutiny is how quickly responsibility gets shifted onto her team. When people say, "Why is her team saying one thing and then another?" they're assuming that every headline reflects an official directive. But much of what gets reported under the banner of sources or insiders is speculative at best. Not every article represents coordinated messaging. Sometimes it represents guesswork, inference, or narrative building, and once a storyline is set, it gets recycled, whether it's accurate or not. This is why the advice to say nothing isn't just strategic, it's protective. Silence limits distortion. Silence denies oxygen. Silence prevents emotional decisions from becoming permanent public records. Ironically, this is the very approach often praised when used by other members of the royal family. Never complain, never explain is held up as wisdom until someone outside the institution applies it in their own way. Then it becomes suspicious. Then it becomes evasive. Then it becomes something to interrogate. There's also an uncomfortable double standard in how empathy is distributed. On one hand, there's sympathy for an ailing parent. On the other hand, there's very little space for acknowledging what it's like to be the adult child in this situation, especially one whose boundaries have repeatedly been breached. Empathy shouldn't be a limited resource. It shouldn't require choosing sides. But media framing often forces exactly that. You're either heartless or forgiving, cold or compassionate, silent or deceptive. There's no room for complexity, and complexity is exactly what this situation demands. It's possible to feel sadness without surrendering boundaries. It's possible to wish someone well without reopening a door. It's possible to grieve a relationship without trying to resurrect it. Those truths are uncomfortable because they don't produce clean headlines. What's perhaps most revealing is how quickly the conversation turns into a referendum on her character. This isn't just about contact. It's about proving something kindness, decency, forgiveness to an audience that has already decided what it wants to see. And when she doesn't perform that role, the criticism intensifies. But personal healing is not a performance. And reconciliation, when it happens, should never be staged for public consumption. The presence of journalists doesn't just complicate things, it fundamentally changes the nature of the interaction. A hospital room should be a place of care, not content. A family moment should not double as a media opportunity. And until that line is respected, any expectation of reconciliation remains unrealistic. This is why stepping back is often the healthiest response. Not because someone doesn't care, but because caring doesn't mean sacrificing your safety, your peace, or your autonomy. And it certainly doesn't mean allowing your private life to become someone else's narrative currency. At the end of the day, this story says far more about the culture surrounding it than about the people at its centre. A culture that feels entitled to explanations. A culture that confuses access with accountability. A culture that demands emotional labour from women while excusing repeated boundary violations from others. If there's one thing worth questioning here, it's not whether a phone number was deleted. It's why anyone thinks that detail belongs to them. Because some decisions are made quietly, not because they're shameful, but because they're necessary. And sometimes the most humane choice is to stop engaging altogether, not out of spite, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. And that, uncomfortable as it may be, is something no headline can invalidate.